A new Star Wars journey begins in the place all good journeys begin. At, well, the beginning. This Star Wars Day, I'm excited to introduce the new Star Wars Canon Timeline podcast, where we will piece together the complete story of that galaxy far, far away in timeline order, from the dawn of the Jedi through the great unknown following the sequel trilogy. This is a podcast for both Star Wars superfans and complete newbies. Listen to the short intro episode now to hear how it works and what to expect over the coming weeks as we set the stage for the new television series The Acolyte, which we will be covering with weekly breakdowns. Subscribe to the Star Wars Canon Timeline podcast wherever you listen to take part in one of the most epic and expansive stories ever told, following all the twists and turns from start to finish. May the 4th be with you all month and beyond. Hi, quick editorial note. We had a technical difficulty with the recording of this episode, and while I spent a lot of time fixing as many of the issues as I can, I regret to say that this episode is of a lower technical quality than you're used to. So apologies for that, but I promise it didn't affect the quality of our conversation. So I hope you still enjoy our overview of the High Republic era, basically the backdrop for the upcoming show, The Acolyte. Welcome to a new era of Star Wars. We'll be spending a little more time in Era 4, the High Republic, though not as much as we will in later eras. So in this episode, we're going to lay the foundation with a general overview of what differentiates the High Republic from, the Old Republic that came before, but especially with what comes later, as you will see unfold, and basically the biggest events you need to know going into the Acolyte TV show, which starts on June 4th or June 5th for most of us outside the US. I'm your host, Elysia, once again joined by DeadeyeJediBob. Hi, Bob. How are you?
Oh, very well. How are you?
Good. Excited to talk about the Old Republic?
Yes, very much so.
Slight editorial notes. We're recording this episode on May 21st, 2024. The content of this podcast was accurate and up to date when recorded, but that might change as more content is released. So we'll issue updates from time to time to cover anything that's been added or changed to the timeline. And if this is your first episode and you want to hear more, I recommend starting with the quickie intro app to learn how this podcast works and the key world building elements like how the dating system works and what canon and legends mean. You'll find a link in the show notes also to a blog post that will give you more insight into what's covered in each episode so far and what's coming soon. So, Era 3, the High Republic. Now, how does this rank for, you said the Old Republic was a favorite. Is High Republic growing on you as you read through the books and all that?
Oh, yeah, it really is. I'm reading the phases out of order.
Right.
Actually, I went from 1 to 3, and phase 2 is actually a prequel, so I can't wait to go back and see what I've missed. But it's certainly growing on me. I feel like I'm getting more excited about it as I read about the characters and the events and the battles and all that.
Yeah, we'll talk about the order of the phases in a minute, but this episode's going to be a high-level overview. So we're going to be covering in this episode the years of Star Wars history between 1000 BBY, which is where we ended our Old Republic overview, up to 132 BBY, when the TV show The Acolyte is set. So, that's toward the end of this era. And again, John from the Lorehounds and I will be covering that show with weekly scene-by-scene breakdowns. But do note that the official dates of the High Republic itself in Star Wars history are 500 BBY to 100 BBY. So we'll talk about that tail end period after the Acolyte's over. And in this episode, we will be spoiling large macro events that occur during the High Republic, but we're not going to get into key character arcs so much or book plots, though we will mention a few key characters you might have seen bandied about on the interwebs or that might get referenced in The Acolyte. We will come back to this part of the timeline later to go through the book and, associated multimedia phases, the 3 different phases, one at a time. And yeah, we'll be doing that sometime after the Acolyte and next spring, 2025, which is when phase 3 will be finished publishing. Before that, though, next week, we will publish a separate episode where we talk about characters like Vernestra Rowe, the lady with the light whip in the Acolyte trailers, who also plays a key role in these books. And we'll also be talking about everything else we know about the story and world building of the Acolyte going in, including new characters and who and what from the history we've already discussed we think might show up. This High Republic era was first mentioned in the 2019 audio drama Dooku, Jedi Lost by Cavan Scott, which features my favorite character in all of Star Wars. So we're definitely going to be talking about that during the 4th era. But this 3rd era, there's no Legends content. It's a fresh new era to explore. What do you think of that, Bob? That it's everything they write now is original.
I love the concept of uncharted territory, and I think it's been a blast for me to learn about new characters and new planets all over again. It feels like, in a way, being that 90s kid that stepped into Star Wars so many years ago when it comes to reading about the High Republic now.
Yeah, and I think that that's why it's an exciting era. That's why I wanted to, start this podcast tied to the release of The Acolyte, because a lot of new people are going to be discovering this era now. And it's definitely one of the most exciting eras because we have a whole new iconic villains and heroes and technology and species and just really rich, fertile grounds for mining. So first, just to define some things, when we talk about the 3 phases, we're talking about a multimedia project called the High Republic, not to be confused with the overall era, although, of course, the entire project is set within the High Republic era. And the project was first called, before it was, detailed what it would be, it was first announced as Project Luminous. So that gives you kind of the vibe. And it's a combination of novels for different age groups, comics, audio dramas, broken down into 3 phases, which we'll get into. Generally quite well loved. Of course, in something like this, there's going to be some books and things that hit harder than others, that are more beloved than others. You do not have to read them all. There's a lot. And it's not really intended for you to read every single thing unless you're the biggest Star Wars fan. A lot of people skip, for example, the younger novels, of course, or maybe the comics. Just pick up whatever appeals to you, and we'll be back to break down what you need to know, even if you decide you don't have any time to read it all. But before we get into the 3 phases, Bob, what are some of your favorite things or characters from the High Republic, what you've experienced so far?
I think one of my favorite groups to explore during this time period are certainly the Jedi, because they seem like a more open, a more inclusive group than they ever have before. They are
what comes later.
They're going out of their way to help just about everyone they can in this time period. And it's something I have had to step back for a couple seconds and get used to. I mean, I love what I'm reading, but at the same time, I'm like, wow, I can't wait to see how we get from point A all the way to point B.
Yeah. Any favorite characters or groups?
I would say Vernestra is one of my favorite characters from the High Republic, but I also like Geode. He's a really interesting, chill character, very laid back character, I would say.
We're going to talk about Geode today, and the Nihil.
Definitely, the Nihil are one of my favorite groups from this time period as well. So.
Yeah, the Nihil are the biggest baddies of this era, and we'll definitely get into them in this episode. So the High Republic project was announced in 2020, but delayed by the pandemic. So it started being released in 2021, and it's still ongoing. Like I said, the 3rd phase won't be finished until spring 2025. And Bob said he's reading out of order, but also the phases were released out of chronological order. So we're going to run through them right now in publishing order, but then we'll be talking about them in the history section in the order of in-universe events. So basically, the difference between publishing order and timeline order is that phases 1 and 2 swap places. Phase 1 is called Light of the Jedi, and this is stories that cover between 232 and 229 BBY. And apparently the premise in the writer's room was, what scares the Jedi? So Bob, what do you think scares the Jedi?
But to me, it seems like I feel like they're a bit more uneasy when they're stretched too thin, when they because Jedi are all about saving people. I think, especially in this time period, going out of their way, being as selfless as they can is important to them. And this is a period in which, no spoilers for me, but there are things that happen, and it's like they're supposed to be everywhere at once. And it's a bit difficult for them to do that, and it's very taxing on them as the events start to unfold.
Yes, and of course, particularly some enemies that they come up against. We'll talk a little later about the Nameless. That, for me, is the most horrific thing to come out of this era.
And I forgot to mention them in terms of interesting creatures that I liked when they popped up. I was captivated.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, because that is just a little preview. We'll get into them a little more later, but they can suck the life force, the force from the Jedi, basically. They can nullify them, and that just is horrifying. And they look like hounds of eldritch horrors. But so the first phase, it was published between January 2021 and February 2022. And I'm going to quickly run through the titles for each phase, but don't worry, there's a lot. In the show notes, I'll provide a link where you can look up the titles by both chronological order, timeline order, and also release order. So the first phase titles are 5 short stories: Go Together, First Duty, Hidden Danger, Past Mistakes, Shadows Remain, 3 novels for adults: Light of the Jedi, The Rising Storm, The Fallen Star, 3 young adult novels: Into the Dark, Out of the Shadows, Midnight Horizon, 3 middle grade novels: A Test of Courage, Race to Crash Point Tower, Mission to Disaster, 2 young reader books: The Great Jedi Rescue, Showdown at the Fair, 6 comic series: Star Wars The High Republic, Star Wars The High Republic Adventures, The Edge of Balance, Star Wars The High Republic Adventures, The Monsters of Temple Peak, Trail of Shadows, Star Wars The High Republic, Eye of the Storm, 2 reference books: The Art of Star Wars The High Republic and Star Wars The High Republic, an Illustrated Archive, and 1 audio drama, Tempest Runner, and 2 web series: Characters of Star Wars The High Republic and Star Wars The High Republic Show. So that's a lot. I mean, I think even people who say I've read all of phase 1 have definitely not consumed everything that I just said on that list. Would you agree, Bob?
I would definitely agree. I mean, it's a given that I can't get into the comic, so that's one big part of it that I haven't really been able to consume. But I'm looking forward to the audio drama. I've actually not listened to that yet, but it's something that I've certainly got queued up in my audiobook library, so can't wait for that one.
Yeah, me too. I haven't either. Most people start their overall High Republic, adventure, not to be confused with the comic books, with the Light of the Jedi book, which is a really good place to start, not just because it's, kicks off the phase, but because it's considered one of the best out of this project overall by a lot of people. So then phase 2 is called, so phase 1 was Light of the Jedi. Phase 2 is Quest of the Jedi. And that is set 150 years earlier in the timeline during the Age of Exploration. So this is when they're going out and exploring the Outer Rim and finding new planets and mapping hyperpaths and things like that. So these stories cover 396 to 382 BBY. Why do you think they decided to publish these first 2 phases out of order?
That is a really good question. I wonder if they did it to appeal to prequel fans and some of us. I have no idea. That was my first thought anyway. I really would like to ask one of the writers that question. I mean, I'm not opposed to it, but I remember when phase 1 was over and I was like, oh, we're not moving to what happened next. We're going back, way back. Right. Okay, that's okay, I guess. I'll take it.
Yeah, I've heard from people that it's harder to get into phase 2 for them because you have to fall in love with new characters all over again. So there's a big debate about reading order in the fandom. There's always going to be the people who are like, if they wanted you to read it in a different order, they would have published it in that order. But I am, I'm sure this is going to make people yell at me. I'm sure there'll be listeners yelling at me for saying this, but I am reading phase 2 first. I'm reading in chronological order because first of all, my brain works that way, then I can better connect the events. And I just want to be able to do, as you're doing, Bob, but you're just doing it a different way. You're moving directly from phase 2 into phase 3 because phase 3 picked up right where phase 2 ends.
Yeah. Wish I could have started where you are actually with all of the prequel stuff, because I think for me, doing it in chronological order is a lot of fun. I would say that's how my brain works. Sometimes I can do either or. I'm pretty flexible with timeline events, but it would have been so awesome to start where you are. So yeah, I would say.
Yeah, no, I mean, I like that because then, I get invested, but you see the payoff of events then coming in the later phases.
Of course, yeah.
So phase 2, they started releasing in October of 2022, but they kind of muddled the releases at the end of phase 2 and going into phase 3. So the titles included in phase 2 there are 6 short stories. This time they're all written by the same author, George Mann, under the title Tales of Enlightenment, but they have the subtitles New Prospects, A Different Perspective, The Unusual Suspect, No Such Thing as a Bad Customer, Last Orders, Missing Pieces. And there's 2 novels for adults, Convergence and Cataclysm, 2 young adult series, Path of Deceit, Path of Vengeance, 2 middle grade novels, Quest for the Hidden City, Quest for Planet X, 3 comic series, Star Wars: The High Republic, keeps going, The Blade, The Edge of Balance, Precedent, and 1 audio drama, The Battle of Jedi. We're going to talk about some of the main events again from these, but we're not going to dive into, we'll tell you what the Battle of Jeddah is, but won't dive into the characters and what the individual consequences are, et cetera, et cetera. We'll save that for when we break down the phases for those people who don't want to be spoiled, and because there's going to be a lot of information thrown your way here, so we don't need to get that granular this time. And so that brings us to phase 3, Trials of the Jedi. And this, again, follows right after the events of phase 1. We've got 3 novels for adults, The Eye of Darkness, Temptation of the Force, Trials of the Jedi, 3 young adult novels, Defy the Storm, Tears of the Nameless, Into the Light. And again, not all of these have been released yet. 3 middle grade novels, Escape from Valo, Beware the Nameless, A Valiant Vow, 2 comic series, The High Republic Keeps Going, and The High Republic Shadows of Starlight, and 1 audio drama, Tempest Breaker. And also, I have to mention that there's another anthology collection of short stories connected to all 3 phases called Tales of Light and Life, and a reference book called Jedi Artifacts that has a lot of information about this era, too. So, yeah, a lot of people catching up, a lot to catch up on, including us. And yeah. But we're going to tell you what you need to know to put this era and the Acolyte TV show in context right after a quick break. All right, let's dive into the High Republic history itself. Or actually, better said, we're going to pick up where we left off, 1000 BBY. So this is a little bit before the High Republic. So we've got the emblem for this era. It's one of the few that's not a circle. It's sort of an even more stylized version of the long-necked bird spreading its wings that we talked about last era. But this time it's in a semicircle shape, and the head and neck are now a spear. So I guess we're seeing a slightly more militaristic edge to the Jedi. They're no longer just space monks. And this is still, representing the Jedi Order, but it's now also being used by the Galactic Republic. So it's golden color, which is a color you see coming back a lot in this era, because it's the golden era, get it? Yeah, so we see just the fact that Galactic Republic is using it. It's how the Jedi, if you're used to the later era storytelling, like the original series, or actually more so the prequel series, then it seems like the Jedi and the Galactic Republic are almost one and the same. But during this era, it doesn't start out that way, but we can see that they're getting closer and closer and closer. Do you have any favorite Outer Rim territories or space exploration stories, Bob?
In the High Republic era?
Yeah, or in general.
Well, I'm probably going to get yelled at too, but I really like stuff that has taken place on Tatooine quite a bit, because that was one of the first planets that I think a lot of people are introduced to. And we actually get to see just a hint of it, just a little bit of it in a certain animated series that takes place during the High Republic. I don't know, Tatooine just makes me feel at home when it comes to Star Wars, and that's certainly a key location in the Outer Rim.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the main locations in the original trilogy. So people are like, why are you always going back to this desert planet in the Outer Rim? And like, well, because, sometimes the most out of the way places play a key role in galactic history. Okay.
There you go.
But yeah, we have hyperspace prospectors mapping more and more far-flung routes. But there is unreliable communication at this point because they're not properly set up at the beginning of the High Republic. And, there's tales of monsters and other unbelievable things coming back. And, of course, pirates. The pirates stick around for quite a while, but they are especially active during this era. Yeah, we also have, at the end of this era, we have a shift in the way that Padawans and younglings are trained. So younglings are what Jedi are called when they're first, introduced as children. And then Padawans, those are kind of the teenagers who are learning to become full Jedi. And because of events that happen in this era, by the end of the era, a new rule is implemented where they're trained younger and they're trained to fight the Nihil that Bob mentioned. And things get a little bit more rules oriented. If they go to get a kyber crystal and one doesn't sing to them, they're sent home. And this is also when the no romantic relationships rule is introduced. So I kind of want stories of legal Jedi romances. I need to know what went wrong.
Yeah, I agree. I would love to get into that too.
I mean, maybe we could get, what if they did? So there's a character that's in Legends that's going to be, we'll talk about her later in the timeline. Her name's Mara Jade, and she might not be able to be brought into canon when her story takes place in the Legends timeline, because the character she's linked to has such a different story in canon. What if they introduced her in this era instead?
Right. Yeah. That would really shake things up.
Gave her a love story with somebody else. Yeah. Anyway, it's also around this time that the royal palace on the diplomatic planet of Alderaan is built. And there's also a sect called the Anchorite sect that was active during this time. And this is a religious organization that believed that suffering was the basis of life. It operated on the planet Jakku, which is a planet we'll be visiting later in the timeline. And although they say suffering is the basis of life, that might sound like Sith. This is actually a light side order. So we're going to learn more about them when we talk about the aftermath novels in the 6th era, but they were active during this time. It's also around this time that the Jedi Temple on Ilum is established. So Ilum, again, is a planet with the most kyber crystals, which are the crystals of power of the lightsabers. And the temple there was constructed in 1014 BBY. In 896 BBY, a little green guy named Yoda is born, and he begins training Jedi a century later in 796 BBY. We're going to talk about him more in our Young Jedi Adventures discussion, because 500 years after he begins training Jedi, he's training young Jedi in these adventures, and that's his earliest on-screen appearance so far. Did you know Yoda was going to be in this show, or were you surprised to see him in Young Jedi Adventures?
I feel like I started following the news of the show when it first came out. I was certainly surprised to see him, because, I mean, I hadn't really seen a lot of him in the High Republic as of, prior to the animated show. So whenever Yoda shows up, I'm always captivated by him. I have been since I was introduced to him in the early 90s as a character. Just such a warm, wise, calm character.
It's interesting. He's he's hundreds of years old. Like, what is it, like 600 or so years old in the time of Young Jedi Adventures? But
yeah,
he's comparatively a whippersnapper to later in the timeline. So later in the timeline, he's completely bald. And at this point, he actually has a full head of white hair.
I want that action figure, Hasbro.
I also have to point out, so we don't know the name of Yoda's species, but there's a female member of his species named Yaddle who was born in 509 BBY. So we'll meet her later. Another important note is that Naboo joins the Galactic Republic in 867. And Naboo, mentioned briefly before, is an important diplomatic location where humans and Gungans live. So, and the Gungans are the Jar Jar Binks characters. And around this time, their civil war is resolved and the planet begins to thrive as a political center. And the following centuries are known as the Great Time of Peace. And this will play an important role in the story beginning at the end of this era. And also around 600 BBY, the large slug-like Jabba the Hutt, the eventual crime lord, more commonly referred to as Jabba the Hutt, is born on the planet Nalhutta. So we're going to be talking a lot more about him and other Hutts as we go. And in this era, the Hutts form a temporary alliance with the Republic to fight a monster plant species called the Drengir. Are you a fan of the Hutts?
I've always been a fan of the Hutts. When you tell me stories of the seedy underworld and its characters in terms of Star Wars, I am definitely listening and you have my full attention.
And then also in 522 BBY, the Citadel, also known as Citadel Station, is constructed. And this is a prison on the planet Lola Sayu, made by the Galactic Republic to hold rogue Jedi. And you can bet we'll be visiting there later.
Yep.
Just to make a point about Mandalorians, in 500 BBY, a suit of armor is forged from their Beskar that will eventually be handed down to a character named Sabine Wren hundreds of years later. So it just gives you a sense of like the sense of Mandalorian tradition and just the durability of their armor. If there were a fight between the Hutts and the Mandalorians, I guess the Hutts never fight their own battles, do they?
Yeah, they try to hire a lot of help.
Including Mandalorians sometimes. But these two groups are active during this point in the timeline. So then around 500 BBY, after 500 years of this rebuilding and growth, we officially enter the peak of Republic history, the High Republic. And this is the golden age for both the Galactic Republic and the Jedi, who again continue to grow closer and closer. But during this era, the Jedi, they're more diverse and transparent, as Bob says. They're more earnest, I would say.
Yeah, I would agree, yeah.
And they have their main temple on the capital city planet of Coruscant, but at this time they also have many secondary temples scattered throughout the galaxy, even out in the Outer Rim, which is where we will meet the Young Jedi Adventures. And they wore white and gold and did more fantastical things with the Force. So this is a really fun era. And also the architecture is like kind of a mix of classical meets Art Deco design. So that gives you an idea of they see themselves as grand but refined little flourishes. And I also noticed, have you noticed, Bob, that this era has more of those like droids that sit on your shoulders like a parrot?
I wish they would go about describing all of that in terms of audio description. And things like that. That's the first I've heard of those types of droids in terms of where they sit. That's really interesting.
Okay, yeah. We'll talk about one, at least one in the Young Jedi Adventures episode. Then other than like in later eras, the only really prominent one comes from the Jedi games, which again, link back to the High Republic. So
there you go, yeah.
So the High Republic, again, the earliest phase in the timeline is phase 2, which starts around 390 BBY. And we get an opening crawl on the website for this phase. It says, "It is a time of great exploration. In an effort to unite the galaxy, the chancellors of the Republic, working alongside the courageous Jedi Knights, have dispatched dozens of Pathfinder teams into the farthest reaches of the Outer Rim. But it is also a time of great uncertainty. Communication is unreliable, and tall tales of mysterious planets and monstrous creatures abound. Prospectors and pirates roam the frontier, and the worlds of Iram and Erono are locked in a forever war. And on the far-off planet of Dalna, a new threat is beginning to emerge. Dun, dun. So I guess that's set in 382 BBY, which is where we meet Pyong Greylark and Orlin Mollo, who were co-chancellors of the Galactic Republic. So they teamed up to end disputes, and Greylark became the more politically active and was mostly on Coruscant dealing with like everyday operations. And Mollo was the one who was traveling to the outer reaches to oversee affairs there. And they had a Republic Outer Rim exploration teams that they discharged to find new hyperspace routes, make contact with new planets, establish communication networks, all of that fun stuff. But one group that they come across is the Path of the Open Hand, who end up finding these beasts that we alluded to before called the Nameless. But actually, we're going to talk about them in the next phase when we talk about the Nile, because these groups actually evolve into the Nile. We have in this era Jedi. Are you a Jedi fan?
I am, actually. I know very little about it at this moment outside of Rogue One, because I've yet to read or listen to the Battle of Jeddah, but I cannot wait to delve into more of its history. I loved it when we got to see it for the first time in a certain 2016 film that I'm sure we'll be talking about at some point on this podcast.
Absolutely. That's getting its own episode.
Yeah.
And that will be in phase, I guess, I'm not sure if that counts as the end of phase 5 or the start of phase 6, but either way, yeah, we'll be talking about it. Yeah, so Jeddah was a small, cold desert moon which orbited the planet Najeda in mid-rim, and we will see it on screen later. But it's seen as a beacon of balance during this time, balance, cooperation, and light. It was home to a bunch of different Force religions that largely coexisted peacefully. And it was also another source of kyber crystals. So you can see the Jedi interest despite the kind of crappy climate.
Yeah.
There formed there something called the Convocation of the Force, which is an advisory body and council designed to promote understanding between the various Force religions. Although the decisions they made sometimes led to backlash, like this Battle of Jeddah, which was between the warring factions of those planets, the Iram and the Erona. They tried to basically forge a peace between them, and it ended up breaking out into a war between like them and the Jedi Order and the forces of the Galactic Republic, just a big mess. But the members of the Convocation of the Forces advisory body were, of course, the Jedi were on it. There's also two groups that have similar names. One is the Disciples of the Whills, and Whills is spelled Wills. So this is an old faith, and they wear red robes, and they believed that both the light and the dark side of the Force were valuable, and that for light to exist, there must also be dark. So the Force must remain in balance. And they preferred to listen and try to understand the will of the Force. They were a quieter sect than the similarly named and younger Guardians of the Whills, aka the Guardians of the Kyber Temple. And these Guardians preferred to sense the Force and its presence, and they were more like warrior monks. They're founded in 483 BBY. Are you familiar with their light bow weapons?
Yeah. I wasn't aware that a certain blind monk wielded one of those until I got the action figure.
Okay. Surprise.
Yeah.
Yeah, so light bows they're basically like crossbows but instead of arrows, you have lasers. And they're a type of bowcaster. And the species that's best known for wielding bowcasters are the Wookiees, who we will not attempt to impersonate again, don't worry. What's your favorite weapon in the Star Wars universe?
I would have to say it would be a tie between lightsaber and dark saber. I'm just a big fan of laser swords. What can I say?
Laser swords are cool. I think, I don't know, is it cheating if I say something like force lightning? Just one of the powers.
That's another awesome weapon. I've always been fascinated by the concept of that and just the way that it looks, since they have done that in plastic form on several occasions.
Yeah, that's cool to see what these other types of ways to use the Force too. So another Force group was the Falanazi, and they were a religious order that they viewed the Force as a sea. So they referred to the light side of the Force as the white current and the dark side as the dark tide. And they could use the Force to create illusions or a projection of themselves that could appear anywhere in the galaxy. So very convenient skill to have.
That takes me back to my expanded universe Black Fleet Crisis days where I first heard of those guys. Wow.
Aw. See? Brought into canon.
Yeah. Fantastic.
We also have during this period a group known as the Lonto. This is a species of plant and nature focused people. They're light side Force users, but the way they use the Force is often to use plants as tools and weapons. And we have the Matukai, a religious self-proclaimed defenders of the light that we don't know that much about yet. And the sorcerers of Tund, who are light side users with cool masks. And there were dark side users amongst the sorcerers of Tund, but they were expelled and they left behind some cool artifacts to be found later. We also have mention of during this period, which this group will play a larger role later. But there's a Church of the Force, which is a loose affiliation of Force users, kind of like Unitarian churches in Christianity. We'll talk about them more later. And in 382 BBY, a delegate of another group called the Yakom attempted to join the convocation, but they were blocked because they were dark side users. And they were actually attacked by some supposed light side users, so they left. That's a bit questionable, right? Do you think being a light side user makes it the Matukai, they say because they are defenders of the light, it's their duty to attack dark side users. Do you think that makes sense?
I feel like that's just a little bit harsh. That probably goes back to my fixation on villains. I probably shouldn't try to defend them as much as I do.
I think that's interesting, though. I like when we think about, why are the villains doing what they're doing? Because if we applied that sort of thinking more in real life, we might develop more empathy and have fewer fights and wars.
Right. If you focused on asking why more, asking more questions, trying to get to the root of, your quandary, I feel like there would be a lot less conflict.
Exactly. In 350 BBY, we get the Trade Federation, and this is founded by a species known as the Nemoidians. How would you summarize the Trade Federation? They obviously become more important in the next era, but...
Yeah, I honestly don't know what they're up to during this time period. I feel like they would have to be featured in more of the books. I would very much like to know what in the world they're up to around this time, because when we're introduced to them, they're quite sneaky and underhanded.
Yes. Have you had described to you, or do you have any action figures for the Nemoidians?
I do. I have, of course, the very well-known Newt Gunray, and
we'll meet him later in the timeline.
Yeah. But they're so small in terms of the texture of their faces. They just looked rather like they have a flat face, I would say.
Yeah. Noseless. Yeah.
Yeah, noseless. That was quite a shock when I opened him back in 1999. I was like, wow, dude. Interesting.
And they also have gray skin that looks kind of rough. I don't know if that's just my interpretation or if that's on the action figure, but...
Oh, yeah. They actually gave it a rough texture, too. So that's awesome that they actually went into that much detail for texture.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, yeah, we are going to talk about them a lot more. And meanwhile, lest we forget, over in Chiss space, which is still completely separate from what's going on in the main galaxy. Around 318, the modern Chiss Syndicure is formed, ending an era where armed conflicts between rival Chiss families was common. So even in the completely separate Chiss space, it's a time of coming together and forging alliances. Bob, have you ever been to one of the Disney parks?
Oh, I would very much like to go. I hear stories about how exciting they are and what all they put into the backgrounds and all of the character interactions. That's certainly something I put on the bucket list.
Yeah. Yeah, I used to go to Disney World when I was a kid, but the last time I went was when I was 18, which was years ago. So definitely before Disney took over Star Wars. But now in the parks, they have a Star Wars section, and it's called Galaxy's Edge. And we're going to talk about that a lot more later in the timeline, because most of the action of that is set in 34 ABY, so in the 8th era. And there's also a virtual reality game called Star Wars Tales from the Galaxy's Edge. This is set on the planet of Batu, which we're going to talk about actually in the Young Jedi episode. It's the main part of the plot is set in 34 ABY, but there's also an expansion for the VR game that was released called Temple of Darkness, and that's set between 233 and 232 BBY. I haven't been able to play this yet because it's only available for Oculus Quest and for PSVR 2, and I only have a PlayStation VR 1. So I'm going to see by the time we get to the 8th era if I can't play these games, and then maybe we can talk a little bit more about the Temple of Darkness too. But if anyone has played it, I definitely want to hear your thoughts. Please email us at swtimelinepodcast@gmail.com, and we'll include it in one of our feedback episodes. We're going to have some mailbag episodes coming up in the future. And that brings us to Young Jedi Adventures, which we're going to pretty much skip right over because it's covered in a separate episode, but it is set for the start of phase 1 and 232 BBY. So Bob, you started with phase 1, right? Did you start with Light of the Jedi as well?
Yeah, I had it in my pre-orders, so I started reading it the day it came out.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any favorites of what you've read so far in terms of the books?
I would say Light of the Jedi, because it really got the High Republic ball rolling, and it was such an insane differentiation between the Jedi that we know in terms of prequel era, which we'll definitely get into, and the way that they are in the High Republic era. I think the more Nihil-centric novels are probably my favorites, because there are some novels that focus on events from the Jedi's perspective, but when you have an author who climbs inside the head of one of the antagonists and you find out why they're doing what they're doing, or you get to see them scheming against other Nihil that might be out to take their position, I just love that stuff.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so the opening crawl of phase 1, which is again the second phase in timeline order, it says, "The galaxy is at peace, ruled by the glorious Republic and protected by the noble and wise Jedi Knights. As a symbol of all that is good, the Republic is about to launch Starlight Beacon into the far reaches of the Outer Rim. This new space station will serve as a ray of hope for all to see. But just as a magnificent renaissance spreads through the Republic, so does a frightening new adversary. Now the guardians of peace and justice must face a threat to themselves, the galaxy, and the Force itself." Dun, dun, dun. I have to end every crawl with that sound. It's just an Elysia choice, not a Star Wars thing. So I have to shout out a couple more short stories that are set during this time that aren't officially part of the High Republic project, and that's A Bitter Harvest, which is a short story published in the Target exclusive edition of Dark Legends. So no, I haven't read this. The story was authored by George Mann, who wrote a lot of the short stories in this era, and illustrated by Grant Griffin. And it's an origin story of those Drengir plant monsters that I mentioned, which are a big adversary in this part of the timeline. There's also a short story called The Coruscant Solstice, which was published in the Life Day Treasury short story collection and authored by Cavan Scott, another repeat Star Wars writer. And this tale revolves around the Jedi Master Stellan Gios patrolling Coruscant during Solstice Tide. So we'll talk about Stellan Gios when we talk more about Vernestra Rowe in the Acolyte preview episode. Okay, there's also a short story called Deck the Halls, which is a story in the Canon one-shot comic called Life Day 1. And the story was written by Justina Ireland and illustrated by George Gentry. And this is about the Wookiee holiday known as Life Day, which is the biggest, which is one that like the biggest Star Wars fans celebrate every year. We're going to talk about that more in Young Jedi Adventures as well. And finally, there's Tales of Villainy, The Gaze Electric, which is a comic story that was published as a secondary story of Star Wars Adventures 2020, issue number 6, written by Daniel Jose Older and illustrated by Nick Brockenshire. And that one is about the imprisonment of hyperspace savant Mari Senteca by the Nihil. So, who are the Nihil? Bob, are you ready to talk about the Nihil?
Oh, yes.
What do you like about them? You were, they do pop up kind of in Young Jedi Adventures, and you were making fun of the Young Jedi Adventure ones.
Well, what do I like about the Nihil? I like that they feel like they're right in doing what they're doing, even though their actions are horrific. They always try to explain themselves heroically before they do something horrific or after they do something horrific. And it's like, guys, you're not fooling me. I know exactly who you are and what you're about. But yeah, keep going with that, I guess.
Would you call them anarchists?
That is, I would say, a very apt description of them. Yeah, I do feel like they're pretty big into the anarchy thing, I would say.
I mean, I guess they're kind of like super pirates in a way.
Yeah. Super pirates is another fantastic description of this group, I would say, because they do take quite a few substances to make them, I guess, more super in their minds, super anyway.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, very interesting group. What I like about them is that it's something new and different in Star Wars. You know, it's not just the Sith again. I love the Sith. You know, I mean, I don't love I love to hate the Sith, but yeah, this is different, another flavor.
Yeah, and they're not your typical Harry and Marv from Home Alone bad guys either. These guys have a strategy. They've got a battle plan, and they're able to keep the Jedi on their toes in ways that, you know, your regular galactic riffraff really don't do, I would say.
Yeah, that's fair. One of the things that makes them very dangerous is that they have access to mysterious hyperspace routes known as paths. And so these paths, they defy conventional hyperspace logic. So they can travel through hyperspace in ways that no one else can. And they can take seemingly impossible routes and just like pop up unexpectedly in the worst possible places when you least want them to.
Yeah.
This is not to be confused with, these paths are not to be confused with something called the hidden path, which is something used in Era 5 to smuggle Force-sensitive children. Although, could there be a relation? Because I'm wondering, like, when we talk about the hidden path later in the timeline, they do say something about, you know, it's basically an underground railroad system, but I wonder if they use these hidden, you know, these paths that the Nihil were using, because we do see this technology resurface again around that time. Although it's not linked to the hidden path, why couldn't it be?
That's what I was thinking too, just a few short months ago when and I was rewatching a certain Disney Plus show and reading High Republic stuff at the same time.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the hidden path more in starting around the Clone Wars.
Right.
So the Nihil, they can be anywhere. They're like the boogeymen, the space boogeymen. Their headquarters are the Great Hall of the Nihil, a space station in something called No Space that's only accessible through these path engines that they use. Now, do you think No Space is a pocket dimension, a different galaxy like Peridia where the Night Sisters came from, or something else?
I wonder if it is related to Peridia or some interesting pocket dimension that we don't know about yet. I like that they're keeping all of that close to their chests, all the writers. I mean, they just use the term, and And I mean, we really don't know too much about it unless, they've gone into it in certain comic books or whatever that I haven't been able to read.
I mean, not that I know of, not that I've been able to read everything yet, but
yeah.
There's definitely a difference in thinking where some fans in Star Wars like when they add scientific explanations like the midichlorians. And I have to admit, I am one of them. But there's also, it seems like it's a huge group that's like, Star Wars is space fantasy. Get your science away from my space fantasy. Where do you fall?
I do love it when they go into the scientific side of things, too, I have to say. And I feel like, George, for one, he was able to do that. And it's just my opinion. He was able to do that without making it sound too goofy.
I agree. So the Nihil, they were formed by a family known as the Evereni Rowe family. They were the ones who had access to this path technology. But they actually evolved from the remnants of another Jedi-hating extremist order, a missionary order called the Path of the Open Hand. And the Path of the Open Hand, they were led by someone called Elysia Zeveron, spelled completely different than my name, by the way. Not that different, actually. Elysia. But she was known to most as the Mother, and not to be confused with Abeloth, who we talked about previously. And the Mother claimed to be a prophet and led this group that believed that no one should use the Force, especially the Jedi Order. They thought that using the Force was abusing it and that it would only cause death and disaster throughout the galaxy. So it was their mission to just get everyone to leave the Force alone. And in 382 BBY, the Path and the Mother came into possession of a living weapon that hatched from an egg. And she named this weapon the Leveler. And this preyed on Force sensitives. And she had something called the Rod of Seasons that could control it. Now, this Leveler turned out to be Nameless, one of the Nameless that we talked about before, also known as the Shri Karai, or the Eaters of the Force. And they were creatures that they were natural predators for Force-sensitive individuals and who looked like Lovecraftian hound dogs. Very cool, very creepy.
Yeah, when they were first brought up in one of the High Republic books, I was just instantly drawn to that species. And my mind certainly went to H.P. Lovecraft when they started describing their facial tendrils and all that kind of stuff. And I immediately wanted an action figure creature assortment. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, they don't have any, do they? They should. I mean, I hope with like people getting into the Acolyte, I'm wondering if any of these might show up in the Acolyte. That would be cool. But I'm hoping that people just start getting more into this era and they start merchandising, because one thing Star Wars does well is merchandising.
Definitely.
So eventually a member of the Rowe family named Marda formed a splinter group called the Path of the Closed Fist. And then after the defeat of after the Jedi defeated the Path of the Open Hand, Marda discovered that the Mother was lying about this whole like being psychic thing. And so Marda used the Leveler to kill her and left and founded the Nihil. So that's where the Nihil originally came from. And the title Eye of the Nihil was passed down within the family, eventually landing on the head of Markian Rowe. And Markian Rowe is a major antagonist of this era who used his position to take complete authoritative control of the Nihil organization and expand it. Now, on the Jedi side of things, is Starlight Beacon, which isn't that just the best name? Doesn't it just like beckon to you?
Yeah, I'd say so.
So Starlight Beacon is a major space station shared by the Jedi and something called the Republic Defense Coalition, or the Republic Defense Corps. And this is one of the two times I have to mention the book/TV show Beacon 23 in this episode, which is all about space lighthouses. That's what we're covering on the We'll Shift Us podcast right now. But it's just funny. There's like two overlaps in this era.
Yeah.
Beacon 23 was published before these books, just pointing it out. But the RDC is a Galactic Republic organization that basically the Galactic Republic did not have a standing army. So they had a series of treaties where they all agreed that if there's an emergency, then the Galactic Republic could take control of the planetary militaries of various planets so that they could like use them to combat the emergency. And then when the emergency was over, the RDC would be dissolved and they could go back to their home worlds. So obviously Starlight Beacon, it was a Jedi space station, but it was set in the depths of space as a point through which people could pass to get to all these, still I don't want to say unknown regions because that's somewhere else. That's where the Chiss are. But all of these, we can call it wild space at this point, the places where they don't yet have established bases. But of course, have you read already in the books about the fall of Starlight Beacon?
Oh yeah, that's pretty rough reading in terms of emotionally. Wow.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to spoil it for you guys, but that's what we're doing here. We're giving the overview of the era, and this falls well before the time of the Acolyte. So there's a good chance, I think, that they'll make at least a reference to Starlight Beacon, which was destroyed by the Nihil eventually. And then the Nihil. So there are several times where the Jedi think like, and this is something that happened with the Sith too. They never learned their lesson. But the Jedi think, oh, we've destroyed the Nihil, but they've only scattered them, and then they gather back up and come back stronger than ever. Or Markian Ro at one point, he kind of sacrifices one large force so that the Jedi think they're all gone, but actually he's kept back the majority of them. And then after they take down Starlight Beacon, so the Jedi Order, they decide to exit the Outer Rim, and some disobey and stay behind, and they get caught behind what's becomes known as the Storm Wall. And Markian Ro, he has developed a technology called storm seeds that have the power to destroy starships traveling in hyperspace through certain designated areas. And this is how he sets up a wall that people can't pass, that starships can't pass. And this is how he claims the majority of the Outer Rim during this time. This is why these Guardian protocols, which mean that the younglings are trained younger and the Padawans are made Padawans younger and all of that. This is to fight the Nihil. So why do you think that they didn't? I mean, we don't really know about the end of the Nihil. We'll talk about that a little bit. We know that they're gone at a certain point later in the time. But why do you think that they kept the Guardian protocols in place once the Nihil were gone?
I wonder if there were some unfortunate losses during the time of the Nihil, things that were probably too horrific to write about. Although I wonder if we'll see that at some point, because
even worse than Starlight Beacon.
Yeah, I think to the Nihil, all Jedi are, they're to be hunted down, and Ro, I can see him going after kids. He's that kind of a scumbag, I think.
Yeah.
Where he would do that. And that's kind of got me a bit worried in terms of young Jedi adventure characters. I mean,
yeah. No, but we're not going to spoil who's all on Starlight Beacon or around it or whatever. But super worried about the young Jedi adventurous characters.
You're such adorable kids, you get to know them. And yeah, that was my thought is, oh boy, I hope they're all okay.
Yeah. And by the way, we have to point out that, so we've talked about Vernestra Ro, the one with the light whip. And there's also this Ro family that runs Nihil. And just have to point out that they are spelled differently, just so you don't think that Vernestra Ro comes from this family. So the Ro family with the Nihil is R-O. And Vernestra's last name is spelled R-W-O-H. She's not evil. She good. So a few other major High Republic plot points from this phase is the great hyperspace disaster of 232, which destroyed multiple moons. And this happened when a Nihil ship, it just popped up in hyperspace where they shouldn't be able to get to, but they have those paths. And a Republic ship crashed into it and it ended up sending debris, like humongous debris, suddenly popping out of hyperspace in random parts all over this sector known as the Herzl system. And the Herzl system was a major food system in the galaxy. So this caused lots of trouble, jeopardized the lives of the billion people living in that sector. And there's a character we'll talk more about when we get into the breakdowns of the different phases. But one of the major characters is called Avar Kriss, who becomes known as the hero of Herzl for her efforts in leading a group of Jedi to rescue civilians during this hyperspace disaster. Meanwhile, in the Nile, just to show you who they are, they were attempting to extort planets that they knew would be hit by the debris. They said, well, we will stop the debris in exchange for some money. So real pirate behavior, real mafia behavior.
Yeah, I wasn't surprised at all when they started pulling that in the early books.
Yeah. We also have during this time a Jedi named Barash Sylvain, who started what became known as Barash Vow, in which Jedi were allowed to become isolated hermits that spend all of their time trying to listen to and reconnect with the Force, which is totally a vibe. And I kind of would be into it when I think about it at this point in my life.
Yeah, that would be fun, actually. I'd be up for that, too.
Would you rather live on Coruscant, or would you rather live on, okay. Would you rather live on Coruscant, Jeddah, or one of the towns in Tatooine?
As much as I like Tatooine, I would have to say Coruscant. I fell for that city planet when I first read about it in Shadows of the Empire in late 1996. I mean, Coruscant's definitely where I'd want to hang my hat.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I would definitely want to visit Coruscant. I think I would love to live on Jeddah just because I love mid-sized city type places that are a convergence of different cultures. Things I love about where I live, which is Amsterdam. Yeah, so I think I would choose Jeddah.
Yeah, it certainly seems like a fantastic place to visit.
Yeah. So speaking of Jeddah, somewhere between 232 and 200 BBY, there's a short story called What a Jedi Makes that takes place. And this is from a collection of stories called Stories of Jedi and Sith. And this is about low Force users. So during the High Republic, most non-Force users who wanted to play Jedi joined the Church of the Force, which we already talked about, but not everybody was happy about that. And What a Jedi Makes is about a kid who tries to fake his way into the Jedi Academy with falsified blood tests because they needed to show that they had a certain level of midichlorians to get into the Jedi Academy at this point. But the Jedi aren't fooled for a second. But when he helps the Jedi stop a kidnapping and he fesses up to faking, Yoda's like, you think midichlorians make the Jedi? The Force is not what a Jedi makes. And Yoda tells the kid to study the writings of Lin Farseeker, who was weak in the Force, but wrote some of the most influential books in Jedi history, including one that pops up later in the timeline. Bob, what would you do if you lived in this world and you lived on Jeddah specifically, let's say for this, and you were low in the Force? Would you try to become a guardian of the Wills? Would you join the Church of the Force? How would you want to, or would you just be like, no, I'm just going to go about my day and write stories or whatever?
I really like the idea of trying to help people make a difference. So either Church of the Force or Guardians of the Wills. That sounds like it would be right up my alley.
Yeah.
Probably the Guardians more so because that's, where one of my favorite Star Wars characters is from. So
yeah, I look forward to talking about him.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, I guess if I was low Force, I would probably become a diplomat, maybe. That would probably draw me in. Ooh. Working with the Jedi.
Yeah, I would. I've always wanted, like, if I ever got to pick what kind of character I'd be in Star Wars, I'd certainly want to have really good relations with the Jedi.
Yeah, that's fair. Well, speaking of favorite characters, once upon a time, there was a navigator named Geode. How would you describe Geode, Bob?
Geode is a rock in the midst of a galaxy of uncertainty and turmoil. If there was ever a chill, relaxed character, you need look further. You need look no further than Geode, I would say.
But one person does call him the party animal of his species. So his species, they're known as the Vintians, and they are indeed rock-like with flinty, kind of flaky surfaces. And they mostly are still, but they can move. And they also have they mate, and every few years they have something called a mating smelt, and they can decide apparently whether or not they're magnetically sealed, giving them protection from wounds and making them capable of deflecting blaster fire. I'm not sure there must be downsides to that, but I don't know what they are. Because obviously, otherwise I'd be like, yes, give me the super skin. But it was this extreme sturdiness, which includes them being able to survive in the void of space for up to 2 hours without any harm coming to them. This makes them interesting to those when they do rarely leave their own planet. And they say they have a complex language, but it can only be spoken by those without a mouth. Geode, he's partners with a human woman named Afihalo. And
right.
Yeah. So, yeah, we have to mention Geode because his existence delights people, not because he's more important than the other characters. And we could get a nod to this species in Acolyte as fan service, but we could also get an Easter egg calling out Afihalo for her heroism too. So I have to say, to those of you who enjoy sentient rocks, just a lot of people very delighted by the existence of geodes. But there's also, this is the second time I have to bring up Beacon 23. It's a non-Star Wars book by Hugh Howey, the author of Silo. But there's also a talking rock character, sentient rock character named Rocky. And Rocky's also in the TV show adaptation, but he's funnier in the book. So I recommend reading the book if you want more rock action. It's only 180 pages. Bob, you have to add it to your ever-growing list of reading.
Yeah, I certainly will.
Where in the Silo series, you've read the first one so far, right?
Yeah.
It's I always think about other things, like, I talked with Martin about Fallout. So I think about like the Howieverse, that sort of post-apocalyptic Earth. Everything can be set in the Star Wars universe. That's one thing I like about the Star Wars universe. It's so expansive. You could, anything, any sci-fi thing basically could be a planet in this wider universe.
Yeah, that's how it definitely feels to me too.
What other sci-fi would you enjoy seeing Star Wars crossover with?
Well, I'm gonna have to think about that. I wonder if that would make an interesting episode in itself, to think about the concept of Star Wars crossovers.
I'm sure in Legends comics there must have been. Star Trek did a lot of crossovers in the comics.
Wow. Yeah. I know they crossed over with the X-Men at one point. I think Star Trek did. It might have been a novel.
Yeah. And Planet of the Apes.
Wow. Now that's a new one on me.
And there was even a reference to Star Trek as a real place in this week's episode of Doctor Who.
Fantastic. Wow.
I don't know. There's so many. Well, I said the Howieverse already. But okay, if anyone at home has any thoughts, what would you like to see Star Wars crossover with? Or does that just sound like the worst jumping the shark idea in the world? Let us know. Send us a mail. The Jedi Order also, during this time, allowed Jedi to become something called Way Seekers. And Way Seekers were Jedi who did not follow the Jedi Council and only nomadically followed the will of the Force, but they would get permission of the Jedi Council to do so. So they asked permission and were allowed to be independent. Good for them. So, by the way, one thing I forgot to mention about the Barash vow of, where you sit and think, is that if you take the Barash vow, you will not take on a Padawan learner. So we talked a little bit about what Padawans are. Padawans are what the Jedi called their learners. On the Sith side, their youngest learner is called, can you guess, Bob?
No.
It's Acolytes.
Oh, geez. I should have known that.
So younglings become Padawan, become Jedi. And acolytes become apprentices, which become eventually the master when they kill their master in the rule of two, which is going on in the background during this time. We're not going to talk about the Sith right now because they seem to be quiet on the surface, but we do know there's an iconic master acolyte duo that is living around the time of the acolytes. So we're going to talk about that in the preview episode. But yeah, it's interesting that the Sith, they never really become their own person until they kill their master. Do you think the Jedi ever become their own person? Even the way seekers get permission.
Yeah. I feel like the Jedi have more, I would say, possibly more freedom to come into their own than the Sith. I mean, Sith are just so busy watching their back the whole time, from apprenticeship even through mastery. I'm sure they feel like they're free to become their own people, but I feel like Jedi are, certainly a more peaceful sect, a much more peaceful sect, actually. So, I would say for Jedi, it's probably
at least on the
easier.
surface.
Yeah, at least on the surface. Absolutely right.
So sorry, you say you think it's easier for Jedi to claim their own identity?
I think so. I mean, I don't know if that's how the Jedi would see it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess because they are just more collectivist in culture, whereas the Sith are more individualistic. But then in the Sith case, individualism, it's just about controlling, one person in charge controlling someone else. Right. Usually multiple someone else's secretly. All right, so this brings us to Phase 3, which starts in 229 BBY, and the opening crawl goes, "It is a time of great turmoil. A year has passed since the destruction of the Starlight Beacon Station by the nefarious Markian Ro and his Nihil marauders. The Nihil have established an occlusion zone in the Outer Rim, stranding hundreds of worlds behind their storm wall. Communications are blocked, and ships that enter are lost to the void or destroyed by the Nihil. The Republic is helpless against this sinister threat, and the brave and wise Jedi Knights remain fearful of Ro's fabled nameless creatures, which the Jedi have learned are very real and very deadly." So the Nihil continue to plague the High Republic in Phase 3. So I think we're going to have to wait for the conclusion of that to get the end of their tale. But we know they are thought to no longer exist by 200 BBY. Do you hope there's a resurgence of the Nihil later in the timeline?
I wonder if we might see something along the lines of them later on. I wouldn't oppose that at all.
Yeah, I mean, if they're setting all this up, and the Nihil have been scattered so many times only to not really be gone, I do wonder if they might still be around somewhere out there in their no space.
And you never know as to whether or not one might make a Faustian deal with a Sith at some point, or who knows? I mean, maybe they already have. There's just so much that we don't know.
Yeah, that's the thing, because this galaxy is so large. So many things could be going on, like everything that's going on in Chiss-Space. No one in the rest of the galaxy is going to find out about that for centuries.
And it's so interesting that this podcast is being recorded while events of Phase 3 are going on, and it's probably not bound to happen at all. But I feel like somewhere out there's probably a Sith sitting around and watching events surrounding the Nihil, and either taking great pleasure in it or possibly pulling a few strings that we might not know about. That's just my personal opinion. That's kind of what I'm speculating on. But they're definitely out there.
You think we'll get some, because the Nihil are allegedly gone before the Acolyte, but you think that they might rear their ugly head again in the show at some point?
I would like to at least see them in flashback, perhaps holo recording or something. Although I don't know who they could get to play an interesting Martian Ro or Markian Ro during a flashback scene. I wonder who could do that.
Oh, I mean, I'm better at judging fan castings than fan casting myself. Uh-huh. I don't know who would be. Oh, I feel like there's some good. I was going to say Jude Law, but he's actually going to pop up in a different project that takes place much further down the timeline. He's going to be in the Skeleton Key set during the time of the Mandalorian and Ahsoka TV series. I don't know. Do you have any fan casts for Markian Ro?
I I wish I did. I think that's more of a visual thing. When it comes to the voice, if he's just going to be behind a mask, I feel like.
Yeah, voice and personality. Doesn't matter what he looks like.
He's got such a charismatic voice. He can go from sounding like he's your best friend to railing at you within 10 seconds. I think narrator Mark Thompson, I'm not sure what voice he's based Ro on, but he's just mesmerizing, as I feel Ro should be, since he is a very charismatic leader.
Yeah.
And he can also be terrifying at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have some. What about someone with like a really iconic voice, like Javier Bardem?
Ooh, yeah, he's got a great voice.
Yeah. And so also set around 200 BBY is a somewhat unusual project. It's a collaboration between Lucasfilm and Tencent, which is a Chinese company that production studio that does like they did the Chinese version of Three Body Problem. They're involved in the Monsterverse movies, huge production studio. But they decided to make a teen-targeted ebook created specifically for Chinese audiences. And they have currently no plans for an English translation and release, so I've not read it myself. If there's any Chinese readers, please tell me more. But the Wikipedia summary of the plot is the web novel follows teenage Jedi Padawan Sean as he journeys through the Akash system, located far from the Jedi temple on Coruscant he was familiar with. Adapting to the local culture, such as chopsticks and the native tongue, Sean realizes that the state-owned corporation which rules Akash system is corrupt to the core, separated from his Jedi master Mostima by the authorities. Sean works with local businessman Li Yu and his group of mercenaries to bring freedom to those whose individual rights were oppressed by the state-supported corporate system and to find his master. So yeah, I wish they would translate that one.
Yeah, I would certainly love to listen to the audiobook if I could. They did do an English translation. I would be up for it.
Yeah, I would love to see, a nice Chinese influenced Star Wars culture. I think that would be cool.
Certainly would.
And then we also have set in 146 BBY, another short story called A Recipe for Death. And this is by Landry K. Walker, and it was part of the anthology Tales from a Galaxy Far, Far Away, Aliens, Volume 1, published in 2016. And this story recounts the disappearance of a sous chef working at Takodana Castle, which is also known as Maz Kanata's Castle. And so in the story, when a sous chef turns up dead, the cook at Takodana Castle holds an unusual competition to find the culprit in A Recipe for Death. So, are you a Maz Kanata fan?
I love that character so much. Indeed, I am. She feels like a crazy aunt mixed with just a very wise teacher. Like a crazy aunt mixed with your favorite grade school teacher. She just really knows how to have a lot of fun, but at the same time, she's just a very wise, very chill character. I really would love to know more about her. I know she does actually feature a bit in the High Republic era. So I'm looking forward to maybe getting into her a little bit, seeing what she was up to around this time. She hasn't been in any of the books that I've read, so it would be fun to see her pop up, though.
Yeah, well, I'm definitely going to break down the comics when we do our phase-by-phase breakdown of the High Republic era. Basically, for anyone who doesn't know, she is a very long-lived, very successful pirate queen. And she was actually born in 973 BBY. So that makes her like 100 years older than Yoda.
Ooh.
I don't think I realized that before. So by the time of this short story that I'm talking about, she's already over 800 years old. Her species isn't named yet, but she looks basically like a humanoid turtle without a shell, kind of.
Wow.
She kind of looks like a gnome old lady, which I guess she really is an old lady. And she gained a reputation as a pirate queen by allowing traveling smugglers to reside in her home. as long as they honor her prohibitions on politics and war. And she basically spent centuries traveling the galaxy, collecting antiques and trinkets. And she keeps them inside storehouses and vaults in her castle. And we'll talk about her, as we said, more during the High Republic era's deep dives, and maybe also for many eras to come.
Yes.
And yeah, that brings us to 132 BBY, the year of the Acolytes, which is where we will stop for now. But we're not done talking about this batch of years before that June 5th premiere. In our next episode, we're going to have actually a mini episode where I talk to both Bob and Marcin about Star Wars Eclipse, which is a game that's not even out yet, but we're excited about. And it fits into this part of the timeline. So we're going to tell you why we're excited and what we know about the ongoing development of that game. And then Bob and I will be back with 2 more High Republic episodes leading up to the Acolytes. It's going to be our recap and discussion of Young Jedi Adventures Season 1, where I will also talk to a new guest, Hjalte, who is a professional animator and the father of a young child, because Young Jedi Adventures is actually a preschool series. Now, you don't have to have watched it before listening to our episode on it. We will let you know what you need to know. It is kind of like for the most part, a repetitive adventure of the week thing, but they do visit a lot of iconic places and some key characters show up in places like Starlight Beacon. So we will take you through what you need to know about that show. But if you want a taste of it at least, then I recommend starting with the Young Jedi Adventures shorts, which are in Disney Plus separately from the main TV series. And the shorts, there's just 6 of them, I think, and you can watch them all in less than half an hour, and they just give you a little introduction to the characters and overview of the setting, so you have an idea of what that looks like. Have you watched the shorts yet, Bob?
I haven't, but I'm definitely watching the actual show on Disney Plus. I'm going to have to go back and watch those shorts, too. I think they're actually on Plus, so I'll be able to experience those with audio description, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, no, I'm pretty sure they're with audio description. They're on Plus. They're just in a different. They're not with the main episodes. They're in as a separate show.
I gotcha. Cool.
And then finally, we'll be back with that preview of everything we know going into the Acolyte, including a deeper dive into Vanessa Rowe and her light whip. But speaking of the light whip, which we've now seen show up in the trailer for the Acolyte, Bob, you brought up Lumia, Dark Lady of the Sith, who used a light whip in Legends as well.
Yeah.
You made the point it's not new. this weapon.
It is not new. And it does it has been known to lob off quite a few body parts, that good old light whip. So
yeah, this is another one where people can get mad if the science is applied, but there's science behind it where they say basically the force around it that usually holds the lightsaber in sword shape. For the light whips, it's a bit weaker, and that's why the light can elongate into this whip shape and be more flexible. So it's not as sturdy and slicey as a lightsaber is on its own, but it's like a whip. If you bring it in with a lot of force, yeah, it's gonna do some serious damage. I guess. Have you ever tried a whip, Bob?
Never. I've never even held one actually, but it does sound interesting.
I've tried it. It's harder than you might think to get it. Yeah, you have to get the right movement, the right snap to it, or it's just like flinging a wet noodle. Yes, of course, we'll also be revisiting this part of the timeline in the coming year with coverage of the High Republic books, phase by phase, as we said. Thank you, Bob, for another fun dive into Star Wars history. Is there anything about the High Republic that we didn't mention that you want to shout out?
Well, I feel like the audio dramas are something really special. Since I'm a really big fan of full cast audio productions, I think if you have some time and you're able to track those down, at least check those out, because I really think they put a lot into every audiobook that they produce at Random House. But boy, those audio dramas really took me back to being a 90s kid and getting into a lot of the EU audio dramas for the first time. Yeah,
good production values, and yeah, the audiobooks are more reading, but reading, reading with emotion and things like that. But the audio dramas are just full on plays. Like they're basically audio movies.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. I love that Star Wars there are some key audio dramas we'll be visiting throughout the timeline. And I'm glad that more of those are popping up.
Oh, definitely. Me too.
And what are you up to over on your YouTube channel these days?
I'm doing a lot of video game play. That's kind of interesting since we'll be going into that in the next episode. Experimenting with a lot of accessibility features and things like that, and hoping that eventually, we do get to see a lot more of those pop up in future games, especially Star Wars.
Yes, Star Wars, get on the ball.
Definitely get on the ball.
If you want to see Bob play, are you playing a lot of Mortal Kombat still, right?
Mortal Kombat, as well as The Last of Us Part 1.
And you're going to get back to the recaps of X-Men and the Spider-Man series from the 90s?
Most definitely. I have 3 new episode reviews from the original X-Men animated series ready to go. They'll be popping up starting May 25th of 2024. And then I've got some Spider-Man 90s animated series reviews, recaps ready to go too.
Cool. If you want to check out Bob's YouTube channel, you'll find that link in the show notes, as well as where you can find us both on Twitter. This episode has been produced by me, published by the Lorehounds, and you can visit the Lorehounds main feed for more content, including you'll find me on weekly coverage of Doctor Who, the new season 1 going on now. Recent episode about X-Men 97, you'll find Bob popping up on that as well. And there'll be upcoming coverage of Furiosa, Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, and other stuff. And the guys in Maryland and other hosts are covering other things as well, like House of the Dragon and Rings of Power. There's other affiliates on the network, including this one, such as Radioactive Ramblings, now covering Invincible Season 2 and Fallout lore, and Rings and Rituals from our favorite Tolkien scholar, Marilyn R. Pecula, and Dr. Sarah Brown is her co-host, who's another top Tolkien scholar. And they are recapping Season 1 of Rings of Power now with a focus on the world building, basically. And then there's Properly Howard, where you get funny movie reviews. They recently did Grosse Point Blank. I think they're going to end this season of Felonies and Fugazis with Rocky. You'll find a Lorehounds link in the show notes, where you'll find links to all of the podcasts and where you can subscribe on your platform of choice. And for those of you listening live, see you next with a look at the upcoming Star Wars Eclipse game. Bye.
Bye.
A new Star Wars journey begins in the place all good journeys begin. At, well, the beginning. This Star Wars Day, I'm excited to introduce the new Star Wars Canon Timeline podcast, where we will piece together the complete story of that galaxy far, far away, in timeline order, from the dawn of the Jedi through the great unknown following the sequel trilogy. This is a podcast for both Star Wars superfans and complete newbies. Listen to the short intro episode now to hear how it works and what to expect over the coming weeks as we set the stage for the new television series The Acolyte, which we will be covering with weekly breakdowns. Subscribe to the Star Wars Canon Timeline podcast wherever you listen to take part in one of the most epic and expansive stories ever told, following all the twists and turns from start to finish. May the 4th be with you all month and beyond.